U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says America does not want to contain China, but with the U.S. and 6 other G7 countries agreeing to stop what they call coercive economic policies with a clear aim at China, is the U.S. saying one thing and meaning another? Plus, India reports over 400,000 new COVID-19 cases on Thursday, another record. How can the country escape these dire straits? Welcome to The Point, coming to you from Beijing. I'm Wang Guan, sitting in for Liu Xin. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the country does not want to contain China or to hold China down, but during the G7 foreign ministers meeting in the UK, the U.S. and 6 member states said they will work to counter what they call arbitrary, coercive economic policies and practices, referring mostly to China. Is the U.S. saying one thing and aiming to do another? And how are other G7 members reacting? Joining me today in Beijing is Zhao Hai, Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and from Memphis, Tennessee, Professor Josef Mahoney with East China Normal University. Joseph, let me go to you first. Along with saying the aim is not to contain China or to hold China down, but to really ask China to respect this international rules-based order, Blinken said, in this interview that he doesn't want a Cold War with China. Should we take Blinken's word for it?
First, the Cold War is as a trope, is a bit of a historical farce. The way it's remembered and discussed in the U.S. is not an accurate reflection of what really happened. It's been romanticized in large measure as U.S. capitalist democracy defeating communism, which is nonsense. But it plays well and is still believed by many in the U.S. at least. The problem is that many of America's allies have a more sober recollection of that period and don't romanticize it. So it's not a good rhetorical device for Blinken's diplomacy. But it is clear that the U.S. is trying to contain China in some respects, as we've seen in Blinken's efforts to rally support for the Quad in Japan, South Korea, Australia, and India, and the way the U.S. has approached Taiwan and the South China Sea, and how it's trying to repurpose the G7 as part of its China containment strategy in Europe. And it's clear that the relations that we have are getting colder, if not moving towards a Cold War.
Mr. Zhao Hai in Beijing, what do you make of Antony Blinken's latest remarks?
Well, I think Antony Blinken is trying to come up with a new terminology to describe the relationship between the U.S. and China. Of course, just like the other speakers has stated, that because the other countries are not following the U.S. into a new Cold War, that's why they decided to abandon this word to try to lock steps with other so-called allies and partners and coordinate their policies against China. So that doesn't matter whether or not they use the Cold War. We should look at the deeds and the actions of the United States to decide whether or not they have that Cold War mentality against China. So far, the action says the otherwise. That means that the U.S. is still trying to contain China, and whatever they're doing is having a negative impact on China, which is exactly pressing down on China's development.
Yeah. In Beijing, China's foreign ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin pointed out that the notion of quote-unquote international rules-based order upheld by the U.S. is vague and has not won wide recognition. That is according to China's foreign ministry. Let's have a listen to what he said.
Only when international order is based on the Charter of the United Nations and international law, it can meet the common interests of the international community. If the U.S. agrees, accepts, and obeys this order, we will welcome this move.
Mr. Zhao Hai, what message should we pick up from the Chinese foreign ministry?
Well, China's position has been very consistent over the years. That is, China only recognized the international law, international rules based on UN charters. And that is very reasonable, actually. If the US and other countries wanted to have a multilateral world, as they say, that means that we need to have a democracy among states, among nations, to decide things instead of following only one superpower, only one country to decide everything, and other countries must follow their lead.
Well, Joseph, what does Antony Blinken and the Biden administration at large really mean when they say China must abide by this rules-based international order?
Well, I think that's not entirely clear because, as was just noted, the U.S. is really, in a very reactionary mode, trying to preserve what they perceive as a status quo of American power, and not necessarily a status quo of longstanding UN Charter rules, which the U.S. hasn't always really been faithful to anyway in terms of its unilateral actions. So I think that this is a talking point, but it's not something that has much substance, and certainly not, as my colleague just noted, with respect to how China views the international system.
Right. One specific question is the question of Taiwan during a joint communique issued by the foreign ministers of G7. For the first time, they said they support Taiwan's participation in international organizations, specifically the World Health Organization forums and World Health Assembly, in light of the region's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Some Chinese media analysis say that this means, this is unprecedented, meaning support for Taiwan's involvement in such groups is, somewhat of a departure from previous U.S. policies. Mr. Zhao Hai, how do you look at this piece of communique that, concerns Taiwan?
I think this is a collective violation of China's sovereign rights. And this is very unreasonable for G7 to make that statement and interfere into China's domestic affairs. It's very clear that Taiwan has no problem participating in any world organization that is not international. When we talk about international, only nations recognized by other countries could and qualify to participate. And China, in a way, can arrange Taiwan to participate only under one sovereignty. So I think for this G7 communique to make that statement is very problematic. And I think the United States is behind it, trying to push forward such agenda because they have domestic laws just passed last year stated that the U.S. government should try to push forward with more international openness for Taiwan. So I think this is the Biden administration is following that law to the words.
Well, Joseph, we know that the previous administration, the Trump administration, and its then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo certainly flirted with the One China policy. I remember Pompeo saying something like he doesn't believe Taiwan is part of the People's Republic of China. Do you think the Biden administration is also pushing the boundaries of what One China principle is?
I think we have to look at the broader trend, one that overlaps both administrations. The new developments certainly run contrary to the longstanding practices associated with the One China policy. But I think you have to remember that most in the U.S. who really supported the One China policy from its inception did so because they did not envision China rising as it has with its political system intact. And they certainly didn't envision the West in relative decline. And, all of this really began to change as President Xi Jinping began to resolve some long-term problems like corruption, while the West, especially the U.S., remained stuck on their own. So in practical terms, however, I don't believe the U.S. really wants to abandon the One China policy, absolutely, but it does want to try to preserve the status quo of its power in East Asia with some marginal improvements of the U.S. position for as long as possible. And Washington sees Taiwan as its key leverage point in this strategy.
Mr. Zhao Hai, do you think the Biden administration will, like some analysts say, abandon its strategic ambiguity regarding Taiwan?
I think recently Kurt Campbell came out saying that the U.S. will not abandon such strategic ambiguity because that's benefiting the United States, China, and the world, making the cross-strait relationship more stable. And I think he's correct in that sense that the United States should stay out of China's domestic affairs. And on Taiwan issue, China has been making very clear that China want to have a peaceful unification, a resolution of the problem instead of using force. However, if China is forced to, we have no other choice, then I think military option is always on the table. I think the U.S. side is very much understand the situation, and I think the better strategic mind understand how the dire consequences if the U.S. is getting involved and pushing and supporting Taiwan independence.
Yeah, another issue is the economic competition. Article 16 of the G7 Foreign Ministers communique says they will work collectively to foster global economic resilience against what they call arbitrary, coercive economic policies and practices. And they also urge China to assume and fulfill obligations and responsibilities with relations to its global economic role. How can the line of arbitrary, coercive economic practices be drawn and be interpreted? Joseph.
On the one hand, China does assert its national interest in trade, as we've seen with Australia. But, not to the extent that we still see from Washington, which under Trump and continue under Biden plays hardball with coercive tactics in economic affairs, from embargoes to sanctions to broader efforts aiming at Russia, China, Venezuela, Iran, and others. And, we can also recall the legacy of the Washington Consensus, which in the recent past economically raped a lot of developing countries. So this language, arbitrary, is a very one-sided double standard. On the other hand, one problem I think that Western countries are struggling to deal with is how China, in response to the global financial crisis back in 2008, began to construct a rational regime of macro controls that can respond to crises in less reactionary ways. Now, this hasn't happened in the U.S. or Europe yet because they remain wedded to certain idealistic notions of free trade and limited government. But at the same time, whenever these crises pop up, they become very much arbitrary and heavy-handed in their own domestic or in their own economic affairs and globally. So I think that this is something that is sort of a disconnect that is undergirding this kind of language.
Yeah. Definitely. Thank you for this comparative analysis. Mr. Zhao Hai, Antony Blinken said the U.S. is not asking countries to choose sides between China and the U.S. In his latest interview with Financial Times, the G7 nations are considering a U.S. proposal for forming coordinated response, however, to counter China's economic coercion. We saw some solidarity over there, certainly, between Washington and its allies. What are your thoughts on this?
I think his words sometimes doesn't match U.S. policy or U.S. actions. Because on the one hand, he's trying to show that the U.S. is accommodating to its allies and partners. They don't want to force those countries to so-called choose sides because those countries have close economic ties, people-to-people ties with China. They don't want to ruin those ties only because the U.S. wanted to have some kind of containment against China. However, on the other hand, when it's necessary, the U.S. is always relentlessly, pushing forward with this kind of making other countries to choose sides. For instance, on the issues of Huawei, 5G and technology, the U.S. is pushing those countries to completely give up Huawei and 5G technology from China and declaring that those companies are untrustworthy or dangerous to their national security. So I think the U.S. needs to really be consistent about what they're saying and allow normal trade relations between China and those countries without being coerced arbitrarily by the U.S. forces.
All right, Mr. Zhao Hai, thank you so much for your insight. And Joseph Mahoney in Tennessee, thank you.